Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm Ryan Murdoch. For show notes, club member bonuses, and more conversations, go to personallandscapespodcast.com. Landscapes contain hidden histories that shaped the development of the world we live in. How we moved through those landscapes also tells us something about ourselves. The book we're talking about today explores the web that has stretched across Britain for over 11,000 years, as prehistoric routeways evolved to Roman roads and pilgrim paths. We'll also learn how land-grabbing Norman barons began the enclosure of the countryside, and how national parks and long-distance trails emerged from the ashes of 2 world wars. A story like this wouldn't be complete without first-hand accounts of hikes into the icy cairngorms and along the remains of Hadrian's Wall. After all, our guide to this hidden history once spent a year and a half walking the chain of mountains that wind across Europe, from Cap Finisterre to Istanbul. We'll talk about that remarkable journey too. Nicholas Crane is the author of 10 books, including The Path More Traveled, The Secret History of Britain's Footpaths, Latitude, and one of my favorite travel classics, Clear Waters Rising. He's also known for his television work as lead presenter on the series Coast, and he was president of the Royal Geographical Society between 2015 and 2018. We spoke about navigating Mesolithic routeways, the legacy of Britain's Roman roads, and how 7th century pilgrimage reshaped the urban landscape. One quick note before we get started. I've said before that this podcast is a one-man show. I do everything myself outside my day job, which is writing, but I can't keep funding it out of my savings. The podcast has to become financially sustainable this year to continue. Many of your writes tell me that you like what I'm doing here. If you don't want Personal Landscapes to sink beneath the seas like Doggerland, then please consider joining my members club. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com to find out more. And now, here's my conversation with Nicholas Crane. I hope you enjoy it. So you cover such an enormous amount in this book, and we can't hope to touch on all of it. So I thought I'd pick out some of my favorite sections. And I was especially intrigued by the sections on prehistory. So who were the first people who crossed into Britain, and what do we know about them?
Well, the story really starts with an episode of extreme climate change about 11,500 years ago, when temperatures in the UK bounced up by about 7 degrees Celsius in a very short period of time, maybe as little as 50 or 100 years. So it was chaotic, and it transformed what was then a peninsula on the edge of the European landmass, because Britain was connected to Europe through this isthmus of low-lying land, now known as Doggerland, across what's now the North Sea, linking Eastern England, what's now Eastern England, with Germany, Northern Germany, the Low Countries, and Denmark. So across this land bridge walked small bands of hunter-gatherers who had probably been living in Doggerland already, in this low-lying land bridge, which was a very fertile, ideal landscape for hunter-gatherers, because it had both access to coastal water margins, so they could go foraging for seafood, they could go fishing, and then inland there were some woods, there were freshwater lakes with plenty of fish, and grasslands where these gigantic horned wild cattle called aurochs would roam. And they used to hunt the aurochs. They're fantastic source of food, and the bone was worked into tools and weapons. So Doggerland was a very rich landscape for living in. But as sea levels rose with climate change, Doggerland got thinner and thinner and thinner, and got progressively swamped. And so people carried on walking westwards towards higher land, which was the place we now call Britain. And there are a large number of early Mesolithic sites, the Middle Stone Age sites, the Mesolithic sites they're known as, but one of the key sites was at a place called Starcar in Yorkshire, on the Yorkshire coast, near Scarborough, and there we can visit for the first time a place where these hunter-gatherers were congregating around the shores of a lake that's now gone. It's now farmland, and they were fishing, they were hunting, they were building shelters. They even built platforms around the edge of the lake, which can be seen as the kind of the earliest known artificial footways that have been found in Britain. So we get that these are the beginning moments, but the numbers of people in Britain were tiny. I mean, in the whole of the peninsula, because Britain was still connected to Europe, we're probably thinking just a few hundred people. So their imprint on the landscape was, to modernize, it would have been invisible. You would not have seen anything that we'd recognize as a footpath.
So you described the routes that they traveled as routeways. So what would that look like?
Yeah, I wanted to, and archaeologists have used this term as well. A routeway historically precedes a footpath. So before there were enough people to create a physical line on the ground you'd recognize as a footpath, there was just too few people to do that, because a footpath is an erosion feature. It's caused by wear and tear of feet on the ground. So before you've got enough people to create these landscape features, you had routeways, so people would navigate using recognizable waymarks. We have to think of, if you like, natural signposts in the landscape. So a group of hunter-gatherers wanting to walk from Doggerland inland would have, and they would, if they were doing it repeatedly year after year, every spring, for example, if they were moving in spring up towards higher ground to go hunting for the animals that lived up there, they would learn a sequence of waymarks that they could follow. So it might be a distinctive shaped rock, it might be a gigantic oak tree, it might be a bifurcation in a stream where two rivers divide as they go uphill. It might be a recognizable profile of a hill. Sometimes it's quite possible they'd also remembered waymarks to do with sort of ancestral happenings, where somebody'd been born or somebody had died, or maybe two people had become betrothed, engaged to form effectively a prehistoric marriage partnership. So there may have been these special places we can't possibly know about today that they remembered. They had these mental maps, and they had no written records, so the writing hadn't come to Britain at the time. So all of these remembered routeways were passed on orally, probably through stories, tumbling down through the generations. So successive generations would have learned how to walk from the coast of Norfolk, where I am now, up into the Pennines, which is, I mean, Ryan, you've walked the length of the Pyrenees. I mean, that's many weeks on foot, and you more than anybody will know that it's not really a big deal to walk 1,000 miles. It's quite feasible. It's just that in this era of motor cars and so on, we've just forgotten how incredibly dynamic and mobile we are as human bipeds. We can cover enormous distances. So it wasn't a big deal at all to walk right the way across Britain and all the way back again in a single year. That would not have been seen as a kind of massive big deal. It wouldn't have been a lifetime expedition. It might have been something some people were doing literally every year.
So what would it have been like to navigate along one of these routeways? I mean, this would be akin to, if a path were like a hiking route, a laid out hiking route, a routeway would be more akin to navigating across this valley, along the valley and up towards a gap, crossing a specific pass, and being attuned to, the temperature, the types of trees, the vegetation as it changed, that sort of thing.
That's right. So a routeway was, you think of it as a corridor of movement rather than a fixed, defined line on the ground that you're following. So it's a corridor of movement. So Britain is a fairly tight topographical landscape. It's got a huge number of river systems. It's got a lot of hills. The landscape changes. If you're going to walk for 3 hours in any direction, the landscape's going to change a lot in those three hours. So you've got multiple options. There are no rivers in Britain too big for a human being to get across. There are some that are difficult to swim, but actually every single river can be crossed by a human being at some point, even down near the sea. So there were no massive impediments to movements. We don't have mountain ranges like the Rockies. There are no glaciers left in Britain, and they'd all melted by the time people first came to Britain 11,500 years ago. So the corridors of movement could be quite broad. And they would have been, they would have learned, as well as using the waymarks, they'd have learned, for example, how to recognize north, south, east, and west. Although they wouldn't have used those terms, They would have known that the sun shines least from the north and that the warmer slopes are on the south, that certain species grow on the north slopes and others on the south slopes. They knew that if they were going to put up a camp, if they wanted to stay as warm as possible, you'd place your camp in a place that was sheltered from the wind, where you would get both the setting sun and the rising sun. So for those circumstances, you're basically looking at a nice wooded ridge trending north-south. That way you get the sun in the morning and the sun in the evening. So there were certain sorts of places on these routeways that would become, if you like, routeway nodes or hubs where people had learned there were good places to stop off at. So we think of them as kind of prehistoric Airbnbs. They would have been close to fresh running water. So you don't have to, if you're going to spend a night somewhere and you've killed a deer, you don't have to, do a 20-minute hike to go down to get your fresh water to rehydrate and to clean the beast you've killed and so on. You want it to be 60 seconds, 2 minutes away. So they would chosen their campsites to be close to running water and, as I say, sheltered from the wind, as much sunlight as possible. And most critically, they would have needed dry wood, because both to keep warm and also to cook. So hearths are probably one of the most defining features of these early prehistoric camps. They'd have these hearths where they'd been lighting fires.
So this then makes sense that they would stay down below rather than rather than the sort of excursion we might do today to get up high to see the landscape in a broad view. Yeah. It's much easier to stay where the food is, stay where the water is.
Yeah. That you've alighted on a on a long running controversy, Ryan, because for many decades, over 100 years, people have written about footpaths in Britain have tended to. They've come up with this kind of romantic notion that prehistoric people travelled along these chalk ridgeways that we have in Britain. So we have a lot of chalk in Britain, and they tend to be followed nowadays by national trails, recreational walking trails, and you get lovely views. They're up high. You go along these kind of undulating chalk rounded hills with great views on both sides, and there's this kind of romantic view that this is how people transited to and fro across Britain. But the reality. But the problem is, in terms of scientific fact, is that there are relatively few prehistoric sites have been found along these ridgeways. It seems much more likely that they were twisting and turning, winding through the deep wooded valley bottoms down below, where they had access to wood for lighting fires, they had access to fresh water, they had access to a wider diversity of wild animals, of game, both for you could fish in the rivers, there were the beasts of the forest, and also they'd have access now and again to grassland when they crossed the flank of a hill, for example. So the valley bottoms seem to have been where these routeways tended to be, and that's where most of the prehistoric archaeological sites have been found, close to water. So the valley bottoms were probably, and also, of course, a river is a fantastic navigational aid. Whenever you're on a river, you know for an absolute certainty that if you follow the water, the current downstream, you're going to end up at the coast. If you follow it upstream, you're going to end up in the hills. It's a kind of dead cert. So if you like, the river systems of Britain were a kind of ready-made physical map. They could use them to navigate to and fro across the country with great certainty.
So you mentioned that your epic walk along the mountain chains of Europe that you wrote about in Clearwater's Rising convinced you that the imagined spaces that you moved through were those of our Mesolithic ancestors. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, this was quite a long time ago now. Between 1992 and 93, I spent a year and a half walking across Europe, following the mountain watershed of the continent from Spain to Turkey, from just west of Santiago de Compostela to Istanbul. So my journey was entirely in the mountains, and this was before the age of mobile phones. I didn't have a mobile, no GPS. For the first 6 months or so, I didn't have a tent. I slept under the stars. And I had a very light pack. I had 20 pounds or so on my back. I had a sleeping bag. I didn't have any waterproof clothing. I just had a cotton jacket. And I traveled incredibly light, because I figured that actually the lighter you travel, the more connected you are to the landscape you're moving through. because you're thrown on your own initiatives to go and find shelter. So I slept in caves, I slept in ruined buildings, shepherd's huts, under trees a lot. I mean, sleeping in woods is tricky. If I was caught several times by electrical storms, and if you're in a wood or a forest in an electrical storm, the trees are crashing down around you, and it's pretty hair raising. But so not the best place to sleep in tricky weather, but you do get shelter. So I learned that the most critical thing I picked up living outdoors for a year and a half was that this did take 3 or 4 months for it to kick in. Living under the stars for 3 or 4 months, I had no torch, no electric light. I didn't have a cooker or anything like that to cook on. If I wanted to have any hot food, I'd collect dry twigs, and I had a stainless steel mug about the size of my coffee mug here, and I balanced that on the twigs, and it would only take kind of 4 or 5 minutes to heat up something delicious like a cup of soup or a tin of beans or whatever it was. And but also I got to meet the shepherds a lot, hang out with them, and they're always very welcoming. So sometimes I slept with them in their huts. Other times we shared a meal, and I could leave them something, they would give me something to eat and whatever. So it's a very engaged process living outdoors. But the thing that really, really had a lifelong impact on me was the way that living under the stars and the sun with no means of electrical illumination, no torch, I became totally fixated on the phases of the moon. So the moon became absolutely enormous in my life because, as you'll know, if you're sleeping outdoors and you don't have a torch, there's a certain amount of ambient light from starlight. And of course, in the mountains, there's very little light pollution. So on a clear night, the starlight will give you enough ambient light to move around on a mountainside, wherever you're sleeping, to collect some sticks or arrange a sleeping bag or whatever. On a night of a full moon, it is so bright that after a while I started to walk all night under the light of the full moon because I could see perfectly well. And I also, my energy levels were on this kind of wave motion. So as we moved towards a full moon, I would become hyperactive until the night of the full moon. I would be literally unable to sleep. I'd just be so supercharged with energy. And then, of course, as it declined through the phase of the moon to no moon at all, I became kind of more introspective and less courageous, and knowing that the night would be dark. By the time it got to dusk, I'd know that I put the sleeping bag down. Basically, I'm not going to move until the sun rose in the morning. So it becomes a slightly more constrained existence when there's no moon at all. And I still get that now. I'm often, when I'm even living in London, I still find myself wandering around outdoors on a night of a full moon. And the reason what it did was inform what it must have been like to be a Mesolithic, a prehistoric hunter-gatherer, forager, moving through this wilderness that became Britain. It would have been quite an organized, well-illuminated method of existing, and they would have had their own incredibly well-developed sensitivities that we've lost now. I felt I really touched what it must have been like to have been wandering without, Gore-Tex and rucksacks and all that stuff that we have nowadays through wild mountains, using just initiative and raw materials you can find on the ground.
It's interesting too how your world expands and collapses based on the available light in the nighttime, like how the importance of mapping your immediate surroundings and creating a mental map of that before darkness falls, so you know exactly where it's safe to move to and what's around you, because it'll change every night. So each time becomes a sequence of setting up a camp in the same way, and the vulnerability to weather as well is a really visceral lesson.
Yes, you're alluding to that. I think I know what you're alluding to. This kind of idea that when you're traveling alone, particularly in what we might think of today as a wild landscape, if you're going to spend the night on a mountainside with no tent, or even when you're doing it with a tent, you tend to you choose your spot very, very carefully. You're thinking about the wind direction. You're thinking about the sunrise, thinking about fresh water. You need 6 foot of level ground. So you're checking for any roots sticking out the ground or sharp rocks that are going to jab you in the ribs in the night. You get organized like that. But also in my case, and I'm sure, and again, this is something I could easily imagine prehistoric hunter-gatherers doing. I would kind of pace the perimeter of my camping area out to a distance of, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 meters, and I would kind of learn it before going to bed. And it wasn't a kind of a job. I just did it without thinking and as a deep curiosity. Okay, so what's this place that's now become my home? It's like moving into a new house. You open the cupboard doors, you go through this other door, you look out the window. Where in my tiny little bedroom tonight? Where are the best views? Where are the big rocks? Where are the trees? Are there any distant views that might tell me where somebody's most likely to come from in the night? Where can I hear any animals? Because I was in the European mountains, there are still bears and wolves and obviously lots of things like deer, and I'd often hear the animals at night. And so you're kind of thinking, okay, so who am I sharing this mountainside with? It's not a question of fear; it's deep, just this curiosity. Have I accidentally put my sleeping bag across an animal track? Because you do get woken up by animals on your sleeping bag, and so you have to think about, okay, so who am I sharing this mountainside with? I'm not, this idea again. It's a Mesolithic thing. They in the prehistoric eras, they would not have seen themselves as a species that far removed from the host species of the landscape they were moving through. So they would have seen themselves as part of a much broader biodiverse ecosystem. They had an identity. They had an idea of self, but they would also have ascribed attitudes and methods of moving to the animals that they were living with. And it wouldn't have been an us and them relationship, I don't think. And we can detect some clues about how they might have regarded the other animals they lived with from the writings of indigenous peoples who have survived through to the modern age in Lapland or Australia and places where that have been less overrun by modern civilization. So we can get some clues as to what they thought, and I'll just briefly mention one of them. One of them was that the tripartite system of the skies, earth, and the underworld. That was a very typical way of dividing up the cosmos, and that survived through to the modern age. And of course, they moved on the middle layer, the earth layer, but they were deeply connected to the underworld and the celestial orb as well.
Would the physical locations of these spots be the thin places that you wrote about early in the book?
Yeah, so the thin place is very interesting. If you imagine, so thin places have been kind of vocalized through Christianity often, but they clearly are a much, much older concept. And in the Christian understanding, a thin place is where the gap between heaven and earth is minimized. It's a place where the two are very close to each other. So then typically a thin place would be, a church or a cathedral or a mosque or a temple, somewhere where people congregate to feel closer to their idea of heaven. But it's a physical place. So before those modern religious concepts evolved, people unquestionably used their routeways to visit thin places. Now, we have no way of knowing where these thin places were because there was no writing; they haven't been recorded. But we can imagine it, and so a thin place might have been somewhere a distinctive rocky outline of a peak. A thin place might be there are various granite, they're called tors in southwest Britain, where eroded volcanic granite has formed these strange shapes that tend to get silhouetted, and you can imagine those and some of them look anthropomorphic. They look like animals, so you can imagine those being thin places. You could imagine, and there were some places, strange stones, isolated stones, oak trees that survived through to the Middle Ages as places that people tended to go to cast spells cast pagan spells. Well, those were probably thin places as well, and some of them may have been thousands of years old. At Star Carr, which is the earliest significant Mesolithic archaeological site in Britain, in Yorkshire, on the Yorkshire coast, one of the first places that was visited by hunter-gatherers coming across Doggerland. Among the hundreds and hundreds of artifacts found by archaeologists there, they found a stag's frontlet, so the skull of a stag with the antlers still attached, but two holes had been bored through the front of the skull cap, so that the antlers could be worn on the head. So worn on a human head. So now something was happening there. There's a huge argument about were these antlers being worn by shamans conducting some kind of religious ceremonies, or were they simply a disguise for human beings to use when they were hunting deer? Well, the frontlets were found near the outflow of a massive freshwater lake. So we could ask ourselves, was that a thin place where the lake, the placid, still water of the shallow lake, converted within a few feet into a fast-running little stream running down towards the sea? So it was a transitional place. You could imagine at transitional places where still turns to moving, a freshwater lake to a river, that might have been a place where ceremonies were being conducted using these strange stag's antlers worn by human beings. So thin places, and then we've all got them. I personally have hundreds of thin places stored in my head that I only know about it, and I'm sure you do too. And I've noticed, if you chat to somebody out walking their dog, you'll find that they've got particular places they like just to stop at for a moment. It might be a park bench, it might be a viewpoint, it might be somewhere where they had a conversation with one of their children or their parents, something that made that place particular to memory. So there's a psychological theory called context-dependent memory, and it's been shown very plausibly that there are certain places, topographical places, features on the landscape that allow us to reboot our memories because something happened there that reminds us. So, of course, going back to a house you once lived in is going to be one of those places where you go back, you walk through a door of a house you left 20 years ago, your mind's going to be flooded with memories you would otherwise have lost. And the same is true of the landscape. So going back in time, if you're following a routeway, you would not just be looking for the physical landmarks, but you would suddenly be reminded of things that had happened there before, maybe 10 years before, that you'd forgotten, but you're standing there by a riverbank in a lovely glade. And, wait a minute, this is where I slept 10 years ago. So context-dependent memory is crucial to our way of remembering routeways and of building mental maps, because back then we were traveling with mental maps. They weren't physically written down, but we could imagine where they go, and we tended to retrace them through memory.
There do seem to be places that are attached to in this way and that persist over time as well, like sacred wells, for example. The place endures while the beliefs change and new beliefs are grafted onto them. And Britain seems to be absolutely littered with these places.
That's right. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or so pagan. Christianity was very good at adopting pagan sites. I mean, one of the famous ones is the city of Bath in the West Country, which is now a really popular, very beautiful city on the banks of the Avon, lovely locally quarried stone, elaborate, elegant Georgian terraces and so on. But long before Christianity came to Britain, there was the hot spring there that was visited by the Iron Age people who lived in the surrounding hills, the Mendips, and the surrounding hills, the Cotswolds to the northwest, northeast. So people came to the hot springs and cast their votive offerings into the waters, which were found by archaeologists. Then the Romans showed up, and they made it a much more formal center of devotion and of pilgrimage. And then subsequently, when Christianity really took hold in the 7th century and after that in Britain. Then, Bath became actually less of a Christian pilgrimage center and more of a kind of center of kind of it was like a holiday resort, really. People tended to go there for the hot springs and the healing waters. There is a connection between pilgrimage sites and the idea of healing. So there were thousands and thousands and thousands of sites, some of them very local, just a tree at a crossroads just outside your village, that were visited by people who thought that if they threw a particular stone or particular sprig of herb across the crossroads, then miraculous things would happen. They would be healed. This is very much frowned upon by the Christian clergy at the time, who wanted everybody to go along to church to get their healing from God.
I'm living in a place that's absolutely littered with such sites. The Shintoism and the indigenous beliefs of Japan gravitate towards sacred sites like this all over. Some right in the middle of the city. Just you'll see a random temple in the center of the city that's been preserved for centuries because it clings to one of these places, or because belief clings to it.
That's still very much the case. There's a very interesting example in the book I've just finished, that's going to be published, the Path More Travelled. I walked the length of Hadrian's Wall with my son, and I did this for the book because I'd never walked it before. I'd visited loads of times, but I'd never walked it from end to end. And Hadrian's Wall, we tend to celebrate today as a monument to Roman military engineering, but at the time, it was the single biggest. In fact, it still is the single biggest obstruction to mobility that Britain has ever seen. It was our version of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, cutting Britain in two roughly midway. And it was almost impermeable. There were very few crossing points. So for the people, the indigenous Britons who had been invaded by Rome, it was an absolute catastrophe. But I walked this thing with my son Kit. We had a wonderful time. We did it in 6 days. It was a wonderful adventure that ended up being part of this book. But the further we went along it, the more I felt very intimidated by this blockage that had been created. The idea that we celebrate it now as a spectacular national trail, and it's a wonderful walk. But because it's a national trail built on obstruction, it's a contradiction. About halfway along, the reason I'm telling this story is that halfway along, there's a site that has become monumentalized and is nothing to do with Rome whatsoever. About halfway along, the wall follows these spectacular volcanic crags. So you get the Romans built the wall along the top of these cliffs. And then now and again, the wall dips down through a gap and rises up again. And one of these gaps is called Sycamore Gap, because growing in the bottom of the gap was this beautiful sycamore tree entirely on its own. And it was very famous. I'd been there with the BBC crew filming it about 10 years ago. So people would literally make pilgrimage, not in a religious sense, but because they wanted to see this tree growing in a treeless landscape on its own, right beside the wall. It was touching distance of the wall, and there are no other trees around there. It's very barren. So the tree became, if you like, a symbol of Hadrian's Wall. And for me, I'd seen it before, I'd filmed it, but when my son and I were walking the wall, it took us about 4 days to reach Sycamore Gap. And of course, I was thinking, I wonder how close. And the day we were camping, so the morning we woke up in the tent, we knew we'd reached Sycamore Gap that day. And all morning, I was thinking, oh, God, we're going to see Sycamore Gap today. Somewhere it's a really special place. It's beautiful. It's just, the tree is symmetrical and it's framed between the upturns of two crags. It's like a painting. So we descend the crag, there's the tree coming down at it from above. And then when we got down to it, we both fell into silence, we were just kind of speechless. And because it had taken us 4 days to walk to it, it became an even more special place. And I remember we just kind of walked around the tree looking at it several times, because there's this kind of, again, it happens in pilgrimages. You think about Kailash in the Himalayas, or lots of pilgrimage sites, and I'm sure it's true of Stonehenge. You arrive somewhere and you tend to circumambulate around the outside of it. You walk a circuit as part of the kind of, it's an unintentional, automatic method of observing what you've eventually reached. You just kind of had this urge just to walk a circle around it. You think of all the stone circles in Britain, they almost certainly involved walking around the perimeter, the ceremonies there. So we walked around it, quite overwhelmed actually, and looking at this beautiful tree. And then shockingly, a year later, in the night, somebody felled it in an act of really atrocious vandalism. The two people who did it have now been caught. But the outrage and upset caused by the felling of this tree was quite extraordinary. I thought the tree was something kind of not that well known. There's no road to it. You had to, so quite a long walk. And Kit and I spent 4 days walking to it. But there's this kind of national outrage and national trust of cleared the site, but it's gone. It's gone, and but the site, perversely, has become even more known. So people now go to look at the stump. So these places that attract devotion can come from very different places, directions. As it happened, the Sycamore Gap was almost certainly one of the routeways through the middle lands between England and Scotland at the time, because it was lower. The gap was low and you didn't have to climb over the cliffs. You could just get straight through. There's a lake on the other side. So it was probably an old routeway before the Romans arrived.
So Great Britain contains a large number of islands, big and small. How and when were Britain's routeways extended across the water? And why did they go there?
Yeah, pretty early on, actually. So within a few thousand years of the first people arriving in Britain, and the prehistoric era basically lasted for 9,000 years before writing arrived in Britain. But the islands were reached early in the Mesolithic, and we know this because there are camping sites had been found on them, and because stones that were collected from beaches or from outcrops on some islands like Skye and Mull in the northwest highlands of Scotland, or off the northwest highlands, those stones were taken to other places on the mainland and to other islands. So the stone that came from these places had a special value, and stone at the time was the raw material of choice for tools and weapons. So typically in the south of England, that would have been flint, but there are other stones too, like chert, that was also used. And so we have to think then of the land routeways converting almost seamlessly to seaways whenever people reached the coast. So they would have had very large, portable, lightweight, seagoing craft that they could use to island hop and to traverse the coasts. At the time, it probably was much less difficult to take a sea voyage and go coasting than it was to tramp up and down through thick woodland and crossing numerous streams. As you'll know more than anyone, Ryan, if you go for a kind of mountain hike, walking through woodlands can be quite hard work. There are fallen timber, and we're talking about before the age of footpaths. So you're climbing over fallen trees. There are holes you can't see. You can sprain an ankle or break a leg in. There are boulders to trip over. It's quite hard going sometimes. But if the wind's in the right direction, and you've got a lightweight boat made of hide and willow or whatever, you can launch it and you can get blown with the wind or paddle along the coast in much less time than it takes to walk. And of course, if you've got things like estuaries, rivers to cross, and it's a coastline like northern Scotland, which has these fjord-like inlets, you're basically cutting the journey time down enormously by getting in a boat. So they were probably navigating by line of sight. They would have seen Skye's very close to mainland, Mull is a bit further off. So they'd have seen an island and paddled or sailed out to it. And it's quite likely that the stones they brought back from these islands were regarded as valued tokens, valued items, because they've been found in other parts of Britain. There are axe heads that came from the Lake District that had been found on the banks of the River Thames. So those axe heads travelled the length of England for some reason. There was plenty of flint in the southeast of England. They didn't need to bring an axe head the whole way from the Lake District to the Thames. They could have simply gone to the North Downs and picked up a lump of flint and made a very good axe head. So some stones had value, and whether they were being traded as valued items or whether they were inherited, passed down through the generations as familial tokens, maybe conferring some kind of power or authority, we just don't know. But they were certainly valued items for whatever reason. And what it tells you is that if you plot the geological source of these pieces of stone against their eventual location where archaeologists found them, you can immediately see where these routeways were. They were long, there were routeways extending the length and breadth of Britain, including the islands.
How much cultural exchange would have gone with these objects? Do we know?
No, there's no way of knowing that. There's some very interesting work has been done in Australia, and that would suggest that there wasn't much cultural exchange. In Australia, there's a site where stone has been carried over hundreds of miles, but that the cultures between the source of the stone and the destination of the stone are very different and appear to have been unchanged. So the object itself may have been carried without bringing with it new ideas or innovations. It might simply have been an item in its own right of value, but we just don't know. I mean, what we do know later on, by the time we get to the arrival of Neolithic people in about 4000 BC, so 6,000 odd years ago, cultural momentum was really, to my mind, astonishingly fast. It took so the Neolithic people came to Britain in about 4000 BC, and they brought with them ideas like mining, farming, living in fixed settlements. So they were not migratory. They weren't hunter-gatherers moving with herds through the wilderness. These were people who lived in one place all year round, year after year, farming and living in what for them were permanent homes. They weren't hunter-gatherers building temporary shelters that'd stay in for one night and move on to another place. These were people living in the same place all the time. So this was a completely new culture to Britain, agriculture. And agriculture took only 200 years to spread from the southeast coast of Britain, from Kent and Sussex, the whole way to the west coast of Wales and to Scotland, which I was amazed by. When I started reading archaeological reports to see how quickly ideas were moving, I was amazed it took only 200 years for kind of nomadic hunter-gatherers to be completely wiped out, overtaken by sedentary farmers. So cultural ideas could travel at phenomenal speed. And you could argue that, in fact, this was the biggest new culture to arrive in Britain ever at the time, because we'd been hunting and gathering since the beginning of Homo sapiens. But agriculture completely changed absolutely everything, including the idea of leaving routeways behind and moving on to what we might think of now as footpaths.
It's amazing how throughout this whole story, the exponential acceleration of this whole network, how it becomes routeways existed for centuries, millennia, most likely, and then paths get established, things pick up speed, and then we have eventually the arrival of the horse. So how did that change the landscape?
Well, initially, not very much, because horses were fantastically rare and expensive when they first arrived in about 1500 BC in the Bronze Age. So they would have been symbols of power and domination. So they would have been elite tokens that would have been regarded by people who didn't have them with respect and probably fear. So they would have been, horses belonged to the elite. Once more horses started inhabiting the landscape through selective breeding, horses were an enormously significant symbol of power and domination, because up until that point, for example, a raiding party had to be undertaken on foot. Now, if you are having a conflict with a neighboring band and you've had an armed encounter, one of you's got to kind of withdraw first, and the ones who are withdrawing first either have to walk backwards or walk forwards with their back to the enemy. So it's a very dangerous exercise to have an armed conflict when both adversaries are on foot. it's going to work out very badly usually for all sides. However, once you've got one of the bands is on horseback, you can strike incredibly fast because a horse can cover broken ground at about 12 miles an hour. A human being can cover broken ground at 4, 5, 6 miles an hour. So a group on horseback can rush in, cause havoc, and then rush away again. And although they might be galloping away with their backs to the enemy, in a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 seconds, they're out of range. So horses changed everything in terms of local and regional power balances. So what, in terms of the kind of footpath network, what happened with horses initially was that the footpaths would have been little changed by the arrival of horses, because horses could simply ride on absolutely every single footpath that already existed in Britain. But what horses allowed you to do was to cross rivers where they were deeper. So horses changed the network. For example, you could ride a horse across the mouth of an estuary, which might be a mile wide, whereas you wouldn't have done that on foot. It would have been too deep and it's too troublesome, quicksands and all the rest of it. On horseback, you can ride through quite deep water. And again, I've used my own experiences with this, but traveling on horseback in Afghanistan and then on a long trek in the Caucasus Mountains quite recently, again with my son Kit. In both those countries, horses are used to cross rivers that are too dangerous to cross on foot because the rivers there are very deep and very fast. So there would be dedicated groups of horsemen to ferry you across dangerous rivers, and you simply stand on a boulder, horseman comes through the deep water, you jump onto the back, hold onto the horseman, carries you on the other side, and Bob's your uncle. And in the Caucasus recently, Kit and I were walking the Transcaucasian Trail over through the border between Russia and Georgia, and it's a spectacular mountain walk. It's quite wild country, and we came to this enormous outwash river from a glacier, and there were 3 or 4 local horsemen charging mountain hikers to get a lift over the river. And we're both a bit too mean and a bit too curious to find out how difficult this river was to cross. So instead of paying to get a lift on a horse, we did take our clothes off and wade into it using ski poles and branches and so on to get to the other side. But it was difficult. And so that would have been, so horses can change the nature of the routeway. That routeway was not really feasible for lots of types of people to use without a lift on a horse. So when horses came to Britain, it changed the nature of the routeways, and they were very quickly followed by the wheel. Compared to Asia, we got the wheel and the horse very late. Britain was a peripheral outpost on the Eurasian continent. So all the big ideas from villages, towns, cities, horses, wheels, they all came to us thousands of years after people in Asia were using them. When we eventually got the wheel, and again, that changed the route network again, because if you have a wheel, you've got to have a wheelbase of 1.5. A wheel is about a meter, so they're quite a small wheel because they were solid, built out of solid planks. But the wheelbase, the width of the wheels between them, meant that footpaths were too narrow to run a wheeled vehicle, and typically a cart had 2 wheels, a wagon had 4 wheels, but even a small cart wouldn't have fitted on an average footpath. So when wheels arrived, Britain's footpaths went through a transformation, and only a small number of them were suitable for wheeled vehicles.
So you said that roads evolved very slowly in the Iron Age. Road improvement schemes were nearly unheard of, just a bit of patching here and there. And then the Romans came. And with the Roman invasion, an entirely new road program was rolled out, especially across southern Britain. So how did the arrival of the Romans change the landscape and this route network? And how did they build such remarkably straight roads?
Yeah, this again, you can see the story of paths in Britain as being a series of transformational upsets. And this big one, because the Romans arrived, we'd already got chariots, wide wheelbase, very fast, lightweight. They were like off-road speedsters. We got 2-wheel carts, we got 4-wheeled wagons, but the system itself had evolved over thousands of years. It was muddy. The paths wound here, there, and everywhere. They'd evolved around indigenous settlements. And what the Romans had already built across the conquered parts of their empire was this systematized road network. So the Romans arrived with a preconceived idea of what a road system should be, and they 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 brought with them two things. They brought with them the engineering know-how to build a surface that was weatherproof, and that meant laying successive layers of stones, then gravels, and then compacted clay or sand on top to create a running surface for wheels that was smooth. Also, they were quite wide. They were wide enough for two wagons, two carts to pass simultaneously. But so they were they had a kind of an engineering standard for building the roads, but then they had this idea of straightness. Now, the straightness wasn't because Rome was kind of had become bewitched by the idea of linearity. It was because a straight line between two places was the most efficient way of linking them. It was just pragmatism. So, and they saw in Britain a landscape that didn't have. It didn't have the Alps. It didn't have the Pyrenees. It didn't have massive mountain ranges that were problems for building roads. It was actually just mainly gently undulating. So it wasn't an issue to build along straight roads. But they, in terms of laying it out, there've been lots and lots of theories about how they laid out straight roads, and the most likely one is that they used a device called a groma, which was a pole with a crosspiece on top and plumb bobs hanging down that allowed you to lay out right angles, and that allowed them to lay out these towns and villas on grid patterns, very rectangular, rectilinear layouts, and then the groma could also be used for mapping a straight line across a landscape. So if you put your staff in the ground, the groma in the ground, two plumb bobs hanging down, you revolve them round and you line them up, and then you got a guy standing in the distance with a pole, sticks it in the ground when all three of them, the two plumb bobs and the pole are lined up, and then you build a road to that, and then you carry on like that. And then now and again you have to do an adjustment if you find that you're veering too far to one side or the other of your eventual destination. Because, of course, the thing is, they were building straight roads between places that were out of sight of each other. So there had to be a certain amount of kind of adjusting along the way. So the likelihood is that they sent out surveyors, agrimensores, in advance to either create sketch maps or to figure out the most realistic way of getting from A to B, avoiding things like rivers that were too deep to ford, because then you've got to build a bridge, very expensive and slow, and avoiding rocky outcrops, avoiding marshes, avoiding valleys that were going to need causeways, which were a big effort to make, and so on. One of the for me delightful little details of Roman road building was something that it's not very romantic, because we think of Roman ruins often as being, fantastically spectacular Colosseum-sized projects. Whereas the humble culvert, it's just drain. The Romans are really good at culverts. So one of the reasons their roads lasted so well is that Britain is a land of streams and rivers, and obviously streams and rivers wash away road surfaces. But the Romans, obviously, they've been doing it all the way across the empire already. So they just, when they're building a road, they build a little culvert, sometimes made with a timber lining, other times lined with stone if stone is available, just to carry the water of a stream under the road rather than to allow it to pond up against the road embankment and then wash it away during storms. So the culvert was crucial to Roman road engineering, and ultimately they created a systematized road network that. This is a massive oversimplification, but if you imagine the island of Britain as being tall and thin, with the Pennines running up the middle and the Pennine Hills running up the middle, they built a kind of ladder with two main roads, one coming south to north, each side of the Pennines, then rungs of a ladder crossing over the Pennines, and then there were lots of that. That's a massive simplification, but basically it was a systematized plan that allowed them to move military units at great speed from one trouble spot to another. That was one of the main reasons for building it.
So we have a sense of what it would have been like to walk these Mesolithic routeways. What would it have been like to travel across or along Britain's Roman roads?
I think probably once the Romans had stopped annihilating the indigenous people, massacring them, the Roman roads were probably felt quite safe, because one of the characteristics of Roman roads is being long and straight and wide. You had immensely long fields of view, so that and for the Romans, almost certainly that they were cutting the woodland away from the edges of the road, so you couldn't get ambushed easily. So it probably felt quite safe, even disregarding the colonizing Romans. But for the indigenous people, it probably felt quite a safe way of traveling. The Romans were fairly ruthless in terms of their law and order. So while they were here, the roads probably, after the initial skirmishes and battles and massacres, Roman Britain settled down into a pretty stable state of affairs. And it wasn't until 300-400 AD, when the Roman Empire started to collapse, that travel became incredibly dangerous. There were so many marauding bands occupying the vacuums left by the Roman colonists that life in Britain became incredibly dangerous, and probably travel cut down a lot. And there were no, a timber bridge is only going to last 30 or 40 years. And so nearly all of those Roman bridges collapsed. So a lot of these Roman roads had gaps in them where you couldn't any longer cross a river on a bridge. So it was back to the idea of using fords again. So life became much more difficult for travellers. So I think that under the Roman era, it would have felt quite modern, actually. The Romans had these relay stations for the posts when they delivered messages and so on. So you'd have had kind of travellers' hotels along the roadside. It would have been a fairly organised method, if you had the money, method of travelling, and felt quite safe.
You mentioned the collapse that happened after the Romans left and how these networks fell into disrepair across broad regions. And then you said there was an increase in church traffic from the 7th century. So how did pilgrimage reshape the urban landscape?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So when Augustine landed in Kent in the late 7th century, he brought with him a really big idea, Christianity, but he brought another idea with him as well, which is the idea of gridded settlements. So reintroducing the idea of organized Roman settlements. And this is coming at the end of pagan Britain. So a lot of pagan sites had been attracting pilgrims already, but what Augustine and his fellow Christian proselytizers did was to introduce the idea of Christian pilgrimage centers. So Canterbury is obviously the main one. That was where St. Augustine set up his first base. And at the time already, pilgrims were traveling to Rome on pilgrimage. So they're making transcontinental pilgrimages to Rome, and a lot of the leading warlords, if you want to call them that, the early English chieftains, the early English kings, made pilgrimages to Rome at this time. So they got into this idea of taking epic devotional journeys across the continent. So travel was completely feasible. Within Britain, lots of Christian shrines sprang up all over the place. Some of them had been pagan shrines beforehand and were simply adapted. And church building took off. Plenty of churches became places that you would travel to. And in a way, when you think about it, a parish church is a local pilgrimage centre, because people back then were having to go to a service. Nobody could, or very few people could read or write at the time. So they would be walking, sometimes probably for an hour or 2 or 3, to go to church, where they'd listen to a cleric, probably spouting a Latin that they couldn't understand. But the insides of the church were often painted with colourful Christian murals depicting scenes from the scriptures that would be stories that they would be able to memorize and share. So there were some of these. So these places generated their own pathways. And one of the most famous in Britain now is the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland, one of the most famous Christian pilgrimage centres in Britain. And when you go there today, and I went there, I'd never been to Iona before until I started researching this book. But I was lucky enough to arrive in a sea kayak and get a real feel for what it was like to come across the ocean and see this small, undulating, very nondescript island. It's not a spectacular island like Skye or Mull or the Outer Hebrides. It's low-lying, it's very small, and it's now a major pilgrimage site, so there are thousands of people visiting every week. But you kind of walk through there's a lovely walk from the quayside along a road, there are virtually no cars until you get to the Abbey site. And then for me, the Abbey's absolutely fascinating architecturally, but for me, the most moving sight on Iona was just a line of stone slabs indented in the turf from the road across the Abbey precinct towards the Abbey doors. And this is the old Coffin Road, one of the oldest pilgrimage roads physically surviving in Britain, that the early saints were carried along on their way to being entombed in the Abbey. And the slabs are still there. And most people going to the Abbey don't realise that that you can actually walk on the same footway, the same path. It's very narrow. It's about a metre wide or so, and it's sunk into the ground. But the slabs are still there. And for me, yeah, Iona was a thin place. It's not so much to do with Christianity, but for me, it's a place where you really sense as you walk. And a thin place, to my mind, is a pilgrimage route is a thin place because the people who are walking a pilgrimage route, and I've walked sections of the Santiago, the pilgrimage, the Camino in Spain. People who walk a pilgrimage route expect enlightenment, but it may not happen when they get to the destination. And when I was walking the Camino in Spain, I asked everybody I met, why are you doing this? Are you expecting to get remission from purgatory when you arrive in Santiago? No. I didn't meet anybody who really believed they were going to get remission from purgatory when they got there. But everybody I talked to had some sort of encounter, some kind of moment of enlightenment or spiritual event while they were on the road. And so for me, an ancient, a prehistoric footway, a footpath is itself a thin place because you have to be walking where thousands and thousands of generations have walked before. And Britain is so well endowed with these historic footpaths that every time you take a walk on one, you just pause for a moment, look around you and think, okay, so what's the story in this landscape? And it might be an agricultural landscape, or it might be, like Iona, it might be a spiritual landscape. But if you just give it a moment and you've done a little bit of reading about the neighbourhood, then you'll be able to sense the weight of memory that place is invested with. So for me, a path is itself a thin place, and it's not a Christian idea but something to do with a deep psychological awareness of your surroundings.
Yeah, I really like that, how you drew connections between both modern and ancient wandering and that deep human need beneath it. In the book, you said, the pilgrim has been with us since at least the Neolithic, and before that was probably a recognizable presence on hunter-gatherer routeways. Modern wanderers may not set off from home with a sacred place in mind, but many will experience the enlightenment, reconciliation, and cures that the path will bring. So where do you think that need comes from? Is it just hardwired into us as humans?
Yeah, I do. I think it is hardwired. I think when I walked across Europe, I was on my own for a year and a half, and after a few, I was never bored. I was continually engaged with my surroundings, and when I eventually got to Istanbul, I kind of had a really strong urge to carry on. I didn't get there and think, "Oh, that's me done. I'm knackered. I want to stop." I wanted to carry on, and so and for me, wandering I'm definitely hardwired. I find it very difficult sitting at a desk. I've paradoxically invented a career for myself, which is writing books, which is incredibly sedentary, and especially non-fiction books. So the book I've just finished on footpaths took 3 years of sitting at a desk, but I can never sit at a desk for more than about 40 minutes at a time. Fidget. So I have to, the whole time I'm kind of going for a walk around. If I'm in a London library, then I'm walking the pavements every couple of hours at least, and lunchtimes, evenings, weekends. So yeah, I think it was Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said, I paraphrasing him, but he said he wrote that he could only think when he's walking. He thinks with his legs, or thought with his legs, and I think that's so true. I think we're all aware of that human truism that you could be stuck with a really difficult, imponderable problem. It might be work, it might be emotional, it might be home, whatever it might be. If you just go for a walk, it's amazing how that helps. How sometimes it can unlock something in your head it's as if you sit down and become sedentary and somebody turns a key, and you just freeze in terms of expectations and hopes and imagination and courage. You go for a short walk of 10 minutes and suddenly the key turns and you feel braver, you feel wiser. I'm not saying it always works. Sometimes you come back in a worse state, but it can really help. So I think so the idea of pilgrimage, it's definitely a pre-Christian thing. And I wrote a lot in the book about a mountain in the Lake District called Pike of Stickle, where there are there's a rock called Tuff high on the mountain above a cliff that was being mined by Neolithic people. And so we're talking about 6,000 years ago, and the stones from those quarries on Pike of Stickle travelled all over Britain, not all, well, vast distances to and fro across Britain. But there's an argument for thinking that the more again, Kit and I did a walk around the Lake District for a few days, focused on Pike of Stickle, and the more I looked, it's a very kind of stridently visual peak. It's pyramidal. It almost looks like an artificial cairn. It sticks above the surrounding peaks from certain angles. And if you think of Mount Kailash in the Himalayas, or Monte Viso in northern Italy, which is another source of stone jadeite. Axes came from Monte Viso in Italy in the Southern Alps. So they're very prominent, and you can imagine people actually not just carrying stone from these shapely peaks, but actually migrating to them, as they do to Kailash now, because there's going to be some kind of spiritual reward in that journey. So I think we've been drawn to these places long before the age of kind of mass tourism and Christian pilgrimage.
You said in the book that looking back at this era from the age of sat-nav, it's hard to imagine an unmapped Britain, and medieval travelers on these pilgrim routes had to ask the way or hire a guide, and that was so normal that navigation doesn't even get mentioned in contemporary literature of the time. So when were the first maps of Britain's roads created?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there were two kind of key moments. One of them was in the Tudor era, when a man called Saxton created England's and Wales's first county maps. So this was an atlas of county maps published in the 1590s, and there were county maps. They're very, very beautiful, but they had no roads on them. Each county was shown in glorious detail: the towns and villages, little steeples and church spires, and they were hand coloured, hand painted. They were beautiful things to have, but they had no roads. All the places just appeared like jewels scattered across the county. It wasn't until over 100 years later that these places started to get connected up on maps. A man called Norden tried it with a county map, and then the big breakthrough came in 1675 with a man called John Ogilby, who created the first dedicated road atlas for Britain. But it was very unusual because they were strip maps, and so instead of the area being shown as a conventional geographical map where you can see, for example, a whole county, a whole region at one glance, these just showed the road you wanted to travel on as a straight line up the middle of a strip. Then all the side roads were little stubs. So it's exactly like following a sat-nav map in your car. All you to see is the road you're going along, and there's stubs on one side, but you have no idea where you are, so you in the kind of contextual sense, you're lost. You just what it will do is get you to a destination. And that's what Ogilvy's maps did. They were post roads, actually. He based the atlas on the contemporary post roads. So they were a great idea, but the atlas itself was quite impractical. It was very, very heavy. It was big, heavy, and unbelievably expensive. So subsequent map makers then reduced it into little kind of traveling editions that could be carried on, so that with you on horseback or in a coach or carriage. So those were the first road maps. Until that point, ordinary people, in other words, people who are not wealthy enough to buy an atlas or a map, were just simply asked the way. So if I wanted to go from Norwich to London, I'd have known that just from the direction of the sun that it was, it's kind of south-ish, maybe a bit towards the west. And I'd go to the nearest market town where I lived, and I'd say, where's the London road? And somebody would tell me, oh, you want to go to Wyndham first. And I'd walk to Wyndham, and I'd get to Wyndham and say, where's the London road? So you go to Attleborough next. So you just asked the way, or you simply paid somebody to take you by carriage or cart. So, and these were known as itineraries. So people would know, for example, if you're making a pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, you would have known that would have been kind of 3 days if you're riding a horse and stopping overnight in inns. So, and they would have known that you just rode down Watling Street. There'd have been a few tricky turns, but on the whole, you just followed the old decrepit Roman road between London and between Southwark and Canterbury, and you'd get to and you'd get to the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket and the cathedral. So these were kind of oral itineraries that you would get advised by people living in the inns or hostelries along the wayside, or other travellers. So the maps did change everything because they introduced an era of independent travel when, if you were wealthy enough to own a map, you could basically, the whole of Britain was in your pocket. You could travel anywhere, and that's by the time we get to the 1690s. So Ogilvy's 1675. By the time we get to 1690s, we've got this extraordinary woman called Celia Fiennes. I've written about quite a lot in the past because she's my great British travelling heroine, really, of all time. Hero. I mean, but she really was a remarkable woman. So she kept a journal of her travels, and she spent a lifetime travelling. She lived on the edge of Salisbury Plain, and she left these journals behind that were not to be published. They were her private journals that only subsequently have been printed and made available. But I spent a long time. I made a BBC documentary about her, and I've written about her in the book. And I thought, okay, what was she up to? Because her journals show the route. If you try and plot her routes, she was going all over the place. And it wasn't until I'd been studying her for a long time that I figured out that her life mission had been to visit every single English county. And it took her a lifetime to do it. And so she rode her horse through every single English county. And this was the age before, obviously, sat nav and there were highwaymen. And she was incredibly courageous. She did once get held up by highwaymen, which she just told them to get lost. She had all sorts of accidents and just brushed them aside. She wasn't interested in daring do. She was interested in British industry and in beer. She was a remarkable woman, very courageous, and her book is one of. I've got several editions on my bookshelves. She's a great heroine. Yeah.
So what's the book called? Is it possible to find copies
of Celia's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Travels of Celia Fiennes. I mean, I'll just this very battered edition here is one of the ones I've got. So this is published. This is edited by Christopher Morris, and I've had it quite a long time now, so it's well worn out. But this was published in 1982 by MacDonald and there are different editions out there. But yes, and she was living. One of her contemporaries was Daniel Defoe, who wrote another very important book that was published at the time called Travels Through the Whole Island of Great Britain. But Defoe was, if arguably Britain's first realist novelist. Robinson Crusoe is one of his books, but he also kept a record of his journeys and wrote this blockbuster. But you have to take some of it with a pinch of salt. He was quite an egoist, and he tended to exaggerate a lot. So the Pennines are described almost in Himalayan terms. So, and then now and again, reading Defoe's stories, you have to wonder, did he really ride a horse along this road? I'm not sure. He didn't just make it up or get it from another book, But Celia's the true source
I'll
for
look her
road.
up. That's really interesting. To fast forward to the present, we live in a world that was completely reshaped, first by the bicycle and then the automobile. And our societies are organized around mechanized travel rather than foot travel. But something that really struck me from your book also was how the automobile changed the urban landscape, not just through roads, but in the way that housing was developed and towns were extended.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bicycle for a very short number of years, 10 or 20 years, was the king of the road because it basically gave you all the freedom of the horse, but with none of the expense. And so it's very inexpensive compared to owning a horse, and it had a far greater range. You didn't have to feed a bicycle. So people, as soon as the penny farthing, the high wheeler, was invented in the late 1800s, people started covering enormous distances on it. The car comes along, and the car was it's a bit like the internet. It's one of these, or AI. The car was one of those brilliant inventions that had an addictive pickup that became so compulsive that at a society scale we didn't consider the implications of adopting this new means of travel. So cars were both invented and propagated without any understanding of what it would do to the landscape, or what it would do to pollution, or to the way humanity interacts. And the book I've written, in part, I hope, is an antidote to hypermobility. And one of the greatest casualties of hypermobility, of the motor car, and of course of the plane, is the quality of thought, the quality of thinking. Speed cuts out contemplation, and it cuts out your understanding of landscape and who you are and where you are. So, and there are many other casualties that came along with motoring, because it took off remarkably fast. One moment there were 10 cars in Britain, the next moment there's 40 million of them, and the whole landscape's been totally changed. So, to answer your question, one of the physical implications of motoring was to create ribbon development along main roads. So roads that had only been used up until that point by horses, carriages, wagons, and bicycles roads became shorter, because a car could travel along them at 30, 40 miles an hour without any trouble at all. And so the developers started building their housing estates along the edges of main roads. So instead of towns and cities being these lovely, tight, nucleated settlements, you had these star-shaped settlements developing with ribbon development, it was called, running out from them. And there was a huge reaction to ribbon development, because it was seen as desecrating countryside, and as one commentator at the time put it, exporting the evils of the town to the countryside. And of course, now it's been going on for a century. Ribbon development has become so common that towns and cities have actually joined up. There is no countryside at all between places that were once independent towns surrounded by countryside. I'm not saying we should get rid of the car or anything like that, but it has caused spectacular damage. And my reasoning behind writing this book was that what we urgently need to do is to recover, restore, protect, and to enhance what I think of as the Internet of Feet. The footpaths, the ancient routeways that we can walk on foot, or ride on a horse, or ride on a bicycle, or wheel along in a mobility scooter, the places that connect communities to each other and allow us to move within communities. So the car has eroded those connections, and in many parts of Britain they've been all but lost. And so it's not possible any longer to walk safely between one village and a neighbouring village. You just cannot do it without running risk of being killed, because the road's too dangerous, and there are no footpaths. There used to be footpaths, but we've lost them for various reasons.
I thought it was interesting too that you pointed out how it threatened or perhaps destroyed two distinct topographies, both of which were fundamental to British culture, and both invested with their own beauties, this distinction between the town and the countryside, or village and countryside.
Exactly. The distinction, those two once very distinctive entities have kind of merged one into the other. And it's now possible to, if you live in a suburban village 5 miles from a town, it's possible to move between those two places completely unaware of the countryside that's between the two of them, because you're sealed in a steel capsule, insulated from the outside with soundproofing, probably with a sound system inside the car, inside the vehicle. So the countryside has sort of ceased to exist in terms of mobility. It's very difficult to go back because most people's lives are far too pressured it's very difficult to say to yourself, I'm going to spend an hour and a half walking to the shops, or I could do it in 7 minutes, in the car. So it's a tricky thing to reverse. But the reasons for, I'm not saying it should be reversed. What I am saying is that the historic footpath network is a real asset, and it's been eroded horribly through time, particularly in the last 100 years since the car arrived. And that restoring it, rebuilding it, protecting it, enhancing it will allow us to regain a sense of individuality and connection with the countryside and the outdoors. And we know that the countryside is one of the most valuable sources of good physical and mental health. And both of those are a problem at the moment in most so-called civilized societies. So physical and mental health are a huge issue. Footpaths are a very inexpensive way of helping to ease that problem.
So we couldn't possibly touch on everything you covered in this book. So I'll come to my last question, which is directly related to what you just said. And it's about a concept that was foreign to me and probably to people in my part of the world. So what is the right to roam, and why is this important?
Well, the right to roam is the right by law to wander, to walk at will over the landscape. So paradoxically, the right to roam in England is most enjoyable in cities where you've got a dense network of roads and alleys and pavements and public squares and so on, where you can wander in vast numbers of permutations of routes without any issue at all with the law. In the countryside, it's very different. In England, there is no right to roam. In Norway and Sweden, there's something called Almansratten, which basically allows you to walk through the countryside wherever you want to go, providing you don't damage anything. In Scotland, not so long ago, there's a right of responsible access to certain types of countryside. So it's not a right to roam. It's a right of responsible access with very, very important caveats. But it is it is now possible to go walking in Scotland's uncultivated mountains and glens, for example, without necessarily having to stick to a footpath. You can wander at will. So it's this idea of a right to roam, is this idea of freedom of movement. And to some cultures, it's very important. It used to be very important in Britain. We've lost the right to roam in Britain, started to be massively eroded when the Normans invaded in 1066. So for 1,000 years or so in England, we've kind of haven't really had it. So what we do have instead are defined public rights of way. So we have to stay on this. A right of way, you can't just suddenly turn off a public footpath halfway along it and wander across the fields. That's illegal. So what we have in Britain is there are areas of open access land, where there is a right to roam. They're uncultivated. They're generally moorland, and you have to access them through defined points on the perimeter of them. But once you're in them, you can wander where you want to go. They're quite restricted areas, and some parts of the country, like East Anglia, where you have intensive arable agriculture, there's a desperate shortage of footpaths and bridleways. So actually your options are very limited. In other parts of the countryside where you've got a history of pastoral farming and woodland, so pastures and woodland, you can have a much denser network of public rights of way. So I'm thinking here of Berkshire or the Cotswolds, the Northern Cotswolds, many more public rights of way there than in Norfolk or Suffolk. But the right to roam as a practical idea is very much linked to population density. So the reason that they got a right to roam in Norway and Sweden is that it's on the whole a low population density. So that you can walk where you want in a Swedish forest. You're unlikely to run into a village or a town. There's simply vast areas of forest. In England, it's a very high population density. So the idea of just saying to yourself, oh, I think I'm going to walk in a straight line between my home and the next village, you're going to be running into, farmers are going to be saying you're destroying, I've got crops growing in the fields, and you obviously can't walk through people's gardens. In Scotland, it's become a practical thing because there's a lower population density. That's why it's worked in Scotland. In the uncultivated areas of Scotland, it's a success. But in England, the population density is far too high.
So you tried to do this. You tried to walk in a straight line up the length of Britain. That really is a nice way to illustrate the difficulties.
Yes, I was wondering whether you might come on to that. Yeah, so I walked in a straight line from one end of England to the other, following the prime meridian, the line of 2 degrees west, 2 degrees longitude. But as an experiment, really, I'm a geographer by heart, and I wanted to write a book about England that was objective. And the only way of doing that is by walking a straight line, a geographical transect. If you follow a coastline or follow a river, you're only going to be writing about people and places along the coast or people and places along a river. Whereas if you walk a dead straight line, a random dead straight line, you're going to collect it'll be a random sample of people and places, and therefore be a more accurate description of a place. And I thought, well, what is this place, England, I'm living in? So I walked a straight line from up near the Scottish border right the way down the middle of England to the English Channel. And a fair amount of trespassing was involved. I didn't much enjoy the trespassing because I'm quite a law-abiding kind of person, but it was very interesting. And what I learned from that was how difficult it now is to move through England on your own routeways that you want to walk on. The only viable way of moving on foot through England is on the public rights of way. It's just too stressful, apart from anything, running into landowners and gamekeepers, but who are all, I'd say, very understanding when I did meet them. We had some very interesting encounters, and they were very generous. And I had no bad encounters at all, actually. But it wasn't. It was much more relaxed. It's much more relaxing in England to be following a public right of way.
Yeah, you can see how important hiking trails and these paths and rights of way are, and more important than ever in our overcrowded, over-urbanized, overly digital world. The ability to get out into these spaces. Yeah, I think it's essential.
I agree, Ryan. I absolutely agree. That's why I wrote the book. I want to encourage the protection of this incredible network that we've got, and to encourage it to be. It needs to be enhanced and improved for future generations. And also, we have a climate crisis on at the moment, indefinitely, and walking, cycling, horse riding, wheeling within our community and connecting community is obviously a very low carbon way of interacting and of restoring physical and mental health.
Thank you for your time today, Nick. I loved the path more traveled, especially the sections on our prehistoric ancestors and what their tracks in the land tell us about ourselves. And I hope my listeners will pick it up.
Thanks, Ryan. Lovely to chat to you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. And please consider joining my members club on Substack. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations like this one, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com for details.